Hey guys, so over the course of the past 3 to 4 months, I have rebuilt my entire home lab. I have a completely new network setup. I built 2 new Proxmox servers with high availability. I built a new NAS device running true NAS scale. I updated just about all of my services, and I tried to do it all following best practices. While everything isn't necessarily perfect, I've learned a lot about some of the things I was doing that seemed small at the time, but ended up being much bigger problems than I thought they would be. Most of it, quite honestly, fell into 2 buckets: lack of planning or laziness on my part. So in this video, I want to walk through some of the mistakes that I made and how I fixed them moving forward. So the first one is not fully thinking through my VLANs, and in specific, devices that are connected to those VLANs. So I have this surveillance VLAN right here, and what you could see is it's really just all of my cameras. So when I set up these VLANs, what I was thinking initially was that I was going to have my cameras exclusively on the surveillance VLAN, and I was going to have the NVR that I use, which is Blue Iris, on a separate VLAN. Now, that works well because I was looking at it from a trusted versus an untrusted perspective. However, one of the things that I didn't think through was layer 2 versus layer 3. So what I mean by that is my goal was to limit access using firewall rules at the router level. So if we look at my zones here, what I planned on doing was I have the surveillance VLAN inside of an untrusted no internet zone, and I planned on putting the NVR in the internal zone here. So basically I would just have to return traffic from the untrusted no internet zone to the internal zone. The problem with that is it requires everything from my devices, meaning all the switches directly from the cameras to the NVR itself, to be online because it's layer 3 routing. We're going through the firewall. So if the firewall goes down, if any of the switches in between go down, the NVR will not be able to access the cameras, and at that point, I won't be able to record any of the footage. So my head was in the right place. I wanted the untrusted devices not to be able to access what I considered to be trusted. But where it fell short is that I now created a reliance on that firewall. Now, there's 2 ways to do it, and that's one of the ways. The second way is to add that NVR directly to the surveillance VLAN. And if you were to do that, what we're talking about now is layer 2 routing. So this is really a layer 2 versus a layer 3 debate. But layer 2 is ultimately saying if 2 devices are connected to the same switch, as an example, we don't have to go to the firewall level. We're just passing the traffic back and forth. So if the NVR was connected to the same switch that the cameras were connected to, and everything else in the network went down, they would still function properly. So that's what I didn't fully think through. So I always looked at it as untrusted versus trusted, but I probably should have been looking at it as traffic flowing through my network. So the problem still exists that I didn't want those cameras to be able to access the NVR because I didn't trust them. But the easier way, or the better way in my opinion, to do that was to use the firewall on the NVR. So I blocked those devices from being able to access the NVR on the firewall on that specific device. But at this point, if any of the switches go down, if the firewall goes down, I'll no longer lose that functionality because it's all layer 2 routing. It doesn't have to get to the firewall to pass those packets back and forth. Now, the second mistake that I made is not using DNS. It's probably not the way that you're thinking. I always used DNS. I always had a DNS server. I always created DNS records, but I didn't really use them, silly as that sounds. So what would end up happening is that I'd go to set something up. I'll use Uptime Kuma as an example. I wanted to monitor my whole network. So I set up Uptime Kuma, and when I was setting up Uptime Kuma, I set it up using IP addresses. And I did it because I remembered the IP addresses off the top of my head, but I didn't add in the step of going in and creating DNS records for everything that I wanted to monitor. So what ended up happening is that when I switched over to my new network, rather than going in and just creating new DNS records that point to the new IP address, I had to recreate everything from start. Uptime Kuma broke. Anything that relied on anything was generally using an IP address. Not everything, but a lot. So just about everything broke in one way or another, and it required me going back and updating it all and using the correct DNS record, which again, I knew was the right thing to do, but laziness got the best of me. And laziness ended up becoming a big problem as soon as I changed some of my subnets around and IP addresses around and everything broke. Now, there's not a right or wrong way of doing this. I just created a video on Pi-hole, and you can use Pi-hole if you want, but I want to show you how this has been set up for the past few months. So just about every single service that I have has a local DNS record. Some of them are used with a reverse proxy. So everything you see here with 215, that points to a reverse proxy server that is running really just for internal DNS resolution, and it has a wildcard certificate. So at that point, if I enter in one of those domain names, it will have a valid SSL certificate. And I did that for all of my services. Using Uptime Kuma as an example, I also did it for the actual devices themselves. Now, using the exact example that I provided earlier, if I did it this way in the first place, all I would have had to do is take this specific DNS record and first ensure that it exists, but second, ensure that it has the correct IP address. And at that point, rather than everything breaking, everything would have worked. Now, again, I know that this is the right thing to do, but laziness got the best of me. So take the extra step and make sure that you do it this way because it will save you in the end. Now, the next mistake that I made is not optimizing my backups. So I have backups for just about everything. I have on-site backups, I have off-site backups. The goal one day is to make sure I have 3 copies of everything, but right now I don't have that set up. But one of the things that will help me get there is optimizing my backups in a way that take up the least amount of storage space. So as an example, I run Proxmox as my hypervisor, but I always ran my backups using a regular ordinary NFS share. I did it to a Synology NAS initially, and then I set it up with a UNAS Pro, and everything worked as expected. The problem with it is that those backups end up taking up a ton of space because it's not using block level deduplication. So what I did is I finally took the time to go in and configure Proxmox Backup Server, but I wanted to do it using an NFS share. So Proxmox Backup Server is designed to run on bare metal. You can kind of get it working with an NFS share or an SMB share, though it's not officially supported. So this has been running probably for like 4 to 6 weeks or so. And what you can see is my deduplication factor is 11.26. So what that means is that if I have 1 terabyte of backups, that would be the equivalent of 11.26 terabytes of backups if I was not using Proxmox Backup Server. So that is obviously a tremendous savings, but more important than that, if you can do backups using block level deduplication, you're probably going to save a ton of space in comparison to using something like file level deduplication. So deduplication is great regardless, but block level deduplication will be more efficient from a savings perspective in terms of total storage than file level deduplication. Obviously, extremely specific to your needs, but it's definitely something to look into. So the next one is unattended upgrades, and this is kind of inspecific to Linux. But a lot of the times when you set up a server, it's not going to be like Windows where it will automatically force those updates to occur and then hard reboot your system. Now that's the best part of Linux, and that's one of the reasons why it's so good for servers, because you kind of manage things. You're not forced into doing specific things. But the downside with it is that you can also go a very long period of time without running updates. So a lot of Linux flavors, I'm using Ubuntu Server right here, but they come with a package called Unattended Upgrades. Run this command here. What you'll see is that it's active and running. So what does this do? In order to get to that, we kind of got to go take a look at the configuration file. Now, everything here with a / is commented out. So you can kind of ignore that because that's stuff that is not running. But what you'll see at the top here under allowed origins is we don't have comments under the security. So app security and infrastructure security. So those two are currently allowed. So what that means is that by default, those upgrades will automatically run, which is important because they're security updates. Now you can customize this even further. So this is configured to never reboot your system, but you can have it reboot your system if you want. So if you wanted to come in here and reboot the system without confirmation, you would uncomment out that line. And then you can even have it reboot the system at a specific time if you want to do that. Now, this is going to be highly specific to your needs and kind of how you use the system. If you're somebody that goes in and updates all of your systems on a weekly basis, it's probably not that important to do something like this. If you're somebody that never goes in and updates your system, you might want to look into that. And even scheduling the reboot isn't the worst idea. Some people don't like to do that. And if this was an enterprise environment, you would never do that. But for home use, if you're monitoring your systems using something like Uptime Kuma, you're going to know if that service has a problem in the morning. Now, it'll be up to you to determine if that service has to be online overnight. And maybe you'll do that for certain systems and not do it for other systems. But the point here is that you need to make sure that you're running security updates. And then periodically, it's not a bad idea to reboot either. If you don't want to schedule reboots with updates, what you can do is just create a cron job that will do it. So this cron job right here reboots the system every Sunday at 9 o'clock at night. Now, again, this is going to be very specific to you and your individual needs, but it doesn't hurt to make sure that each system is being updated properly and potentially even being rebooted if you're not somebody that regularly reboots these systems. So the next thing is kind of the very first thing that you should do. I left it for last because I don't know how many people this will apply to. But if you're like me, it could make a tremendous difference. So when I moved in to where I live, the person that had set up just about everything had all of the networking wires and everything running into a closet. To me at the time, the easiest thing was, well, that's where the router and all my switches and everything will live. So when I went through and rethought this entire new setup that I planned, I realized that the best place for all of that equipment was not in that closet. So this is a diagram of what my home lab was. And what you can see is in that closet, what I used to have was my router, my switch, I had an access point, I had 2 Proxmox nodes, I had my NAS, I had 1 camera, which then would have to go to another switch for all of my other cameras. And overall, it just never really made sense to be in the location that it was. So with the new setup that I have my router, I have my switch, I have a second switch, I have all the cameras running to that one switch. I have my Proxmox cluster, I have my NAS devices. They're all in the same location, and I don't have any temperature issues. But when I moved in, I didn't have the time to really plan that stuff out. It was there, and I just put it there. And one of the best things that I did was move everything down there. If you're in the process of redoing something, or if you just want to plan it out to be a little bit more efficient than it is, possibly moving the location could be an option for you. Now, at the end of the day, you can only plan so much, but I guess really what I'm trying to say here is make sure that you try to do your best planning up front because it's going to save you in the end. And second, if you're lazy like I am, make sure that you don't make some of the mistakes that I made, because in the long run, it will save you a bunch of time, even though in the short term, it's an extra few steps. So I know that some of this might apply to you, some of it might not, but I'm hoping that you got some value out of this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. But if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.